Hey, so good evening and welcome to our monthly webinar presented by the North Metro chapter of the Georgia Native Plant Society, the Education Committee. So my name is Michael Cowan. I am the chairman of the state board, but also an active member of the North Metro chapter and the Education Committee. And that is, again, who is bringing you this series. So we're very excited today to bring you one of our own, Georgia Native Plant Society manager. So Kelley Hanada has actually been working with Georgia Native Plant Society for several years managing our community-supported propagation program. So with that, Kelley, I'm going to hand it off to you.
All right. Thank you very much for having me, Michael, in the introduction. I appreciate you guys, North Metro, for tuning in. So, yes, I'm Kelley, and today we are going to be talking about vegetative propagation by stem cuttings. So, just a little bit of background on this presentation. It used to be kind of a 2-hour workshop that we would host at Stone Mountain near our propagation site, where we would just give this lecture and then do a hands-on portion. So, we're going to try to cram all of that good stuff into this 1 hour. But it's basically, we're just going to give you a basic overview of what stem cutting propagation is and how you can get started at home and show you some of the techniques that we use at one of our community supported propagation sites. So I do want to give a brief overview of what vegetative propagation is. So plants will do this naturally in their environment, and this is just a way for them to persist through some sort of adverse growing condition or a disturbance in the ecosystem. So oftentimes plants will have modified stems in the form of a bulb, corm, tuber, or an underground rhizome that allows them to spread or persist throughout a growing season. Sometimes what will happen is that, there's a larger disturbance, say a storm comes, knocks down a bigger tree, and it takes away a plant, and it'll knock it to the ground. And what the plant will do is, and it's kind of, one of the inspiring things working with plants is that, once you see that something is alive, it just doesn't want to die, it wants to keep living. And that is kind of where layering comes out, is where they will send out new roots from their stem. And it's this aspect of the plant biology that we take advantage of as humans or horticulturalists and grow plants, propagate them asexually through stem cuttings. And tissue culture would be another sort of man-made horticultural technique that you kind of need sterile environment, so we won't quite touch on that. But one thing to make note of is that whenever you propagate something vegetatively, it's a form of clonal regeneration, which is making a genetic uniform copy, which comes with some pros and cons. And we'll kind of start with the uniform genetics as where there can be some pros and cons to it. So horticulturalists will try to take its stem cutting from certain landscape shrubs as a way to promote its growth habit. If it has an interesting flower form or fall color, they will try to capture that, preserve it, put into the trade as a way for people to have some sort of reliable traits that they find desirable in their home landscape. Of course, the negative downtake from that is in it kind of will reduce the overall genetic diversity, which could lead to other population pressures for that species. But there are all a host of reasons why it's still beneficial to try to start propagation through stem cuttings. And the one main sort of reason for that would be the time that it takes for you to get a mature plant that is going to be able to produce flowers, because I think that's one of the features a lot of us try to include more plants into our lives with. It's going to take a lot shorter of a time for you to get a plant that is going to be flowering if you're starting from seed. Of course, some of the downsides from that is that you're going to need some more materials. So getting started, there may be some more upfront costs associated with more materials that you may not readily have available. So it is, one of those things that you'll have to acquire. And then generally for commercial trades, they don't really try to mess with species that don't root readily. So if it doesn't have over a 50% success rate, a lot of the commercial nurseries won't necessarily try it. I only mention that if you were a backyard hobbyist grower and you were to try to root out 10 cuttings and you got one of them, I think we would all kind of consider that a success and worth one more free plant and worth trying. So I think as we're trying to learn about stem cuttings, we want to make sure that our efforts aren't wasted and we have some success. So I've mentioned earlier about different kind of commercial nurseries. The one thing to make note of is that, you're probably not the first person that wants to propagate that plant vegetatively. So it's always beneficial to kind of do some research, see what others have done, see what worked for them, and find out what didn't work for them. But research is going to be highly influential on leading to success. Um, and it's not necessarily research that you conduct in a book. Like I'll share some references coming on my next slide, but coming to one of our propagation work days at Byron or Stone Mountain Park is a wonderful way to get that hands-on experience, learn from others, or actually see what is working or what did not work. As we'll kind of talk throughout this presentation, is timing is key for a lot of elements, whether it's the time of year that you're taking the cutting, depending on the species, or also the time of day we'll touch on is very important. But more important for success is going to be the process and techniques that you apply during your stem cutting propagation. That will certainly kind of lead to, will be a more determining factor over any of the other cultural controls that we're going to touch base on. And if you do have success, definitely be keeping records of that. If you want to continue to have that success, know what you did right, what sort of timing you did, and we'll kind of also touch base of that at the end of this presentation. So I did mention some of our primary resources that we rely on at our CSP workdays. On the left is the Dr. Durr book. So this is an interesting example because this is what is used around the world for how to propagate any sort of woody specimen, but whether it be by seed or stem cutting. The benefit that we have is that he was a professor at University of Georgia. All of his trial gardens were based out of the Piedmont area. So a lot of the success or trials that they would have published in this book would certainly apply to a lot of the gardeners here operating in the Piedmont of Georgia. So that is just kind of a beneficial coincidence for us. And if you've been to a work day, you'll always hear us reference the Jan book or Midgley. So this is a self-published book. And I would like to just say that, one of the reasons why she was able to put this excellent resource together is because she was a diligent record keeper. And so she's able to go back and record all of these, condense it down into a digestible copy for us. So certainly recommend this book. That because it's self-published, you want to contact her email right there, midgleyjan231 at Gmail, and just let her know, hey, I want a copy of the propagation manual. Um, all right, so we're gonna dive into some of the biology of the stem cuttings, and it's all going to be covered in this one slide and this one picture. And that's just because, I don't want us to get too hung up on it. I just want you to be aware that this is driven by natural biological processes in the plant. And we just want to kind of take advantage of that and use it to our strengths. So the thing to be aware of is that new roots are formed as a wound response. And this is a process that is driven by hormones, that primary hormone being auxin. So we will touch base about that sort of rooting hormone and as well as the importance of auxin in a few other and in a later slide as well as our demonstration. But as you can see on our little picture here, one of the few pictures I included for you guys today. Sorry about that. But you can see roots emerging, and kind of where they're emerging from is that leaf node that was removed and has kind of calloused over. And so if that is some terminologies that you're not familiar with, let's just go ahead and cover that right now. So another inspiring thing about plants is like they're kind of like magic, right? They're creating their own energy, but they also have uh, a layer of tissue surrounding them that creates essentially what are, in the human version of stem cells, but cells that are able to become any other part of the plant. That's referred to as totopotency. For stem cuttings, the two kind of meristem tissues that we'll be concerned with would be the apical meristem. So this is the grouping of specialized cells that wants to make the plant grow taller. And then the lateral meristem, that is going to be responsible for diffuse secondary growth, making it wider. So I mentioned a node on my previous slide of where the roots are going to emerge. And this is just a portion on the stem where the bud or leaf is emerging. And the reason why that is important is because they have a highly concentration of those meristematic cells. So good chance for those to kind of send out a root as a wound response. And then second, the second term, or sorry, I guess the last term on here is the cambium layer. So this refers to when you're trying to do woody propagation or stem cutting propagation for a woody plant. And what we talk about for woody plant is basically its vascular tissue. So any plant that has vascular tissue that persists throughout the year would be considered woody. Whereas if it dies back and goes dormant, that would be an herbaceous plant. And that's just important to make note of if you're doing an herbaceous or woody plant, because that will kind of affect the sort of treatment and timing that you're going to be doing your stem cutting for. The last two terms on this slide, you don't necessarily need to know what you don't need to know the names of them, but you should be familiar with the concepts of what is behind them. So polarity is just means that there is an up and a down to a plant. And so when you're sticking your cuttings, the portion of the stem that is down or towards the ground, you want to make sure that you're maintaining that orientation. It is very important. That is one thing that the plant cannot overcome is if it's flipped upside down, it will not send out any sort of roots or regeneration. Um, and sometimes when you're making your cuttings, it's helpful to take the down portion, cut it more at an angle, and then your top portion more kind of flat. And this will, as you're sorting through your cuttings a little bit later, you're able to kind of easily orient it. Because sometimes, you'd think that it's obvious with the way that the leaf's facing, but if it's got kind of like a longer stem or petiole and can be bent a long ways, it can be a little confusing. So it's just one um, trick to keep them oriented the same way because polarity is very important to try to get your stem cuttings to work. And these last two terms, again, you don't necessarily need to know what topophysis or how to pronounce that plagiotropism. I probably mispronounced it there anyway. But it's basically saying certain plant parts of the plant will perform a certain way. Meaning, if you take a cutting from a lateral branch for certain species, it will continue to grow as a lateral branch. Even no matter the amount of training you do, it'll always be kind of an awkward looking shrub. Again, that's very much species dependent. It will not all plants will do that. So it does depend, and part of that is doing your research ahead of time. But some of that comes into is selecting the type of cutting from the plant itself. You kind of want one already oriented in the direction that you want to continue it to grow. So to give you an idea, like sometimes plants will often send up root suckers or epicormic water sprouts that are growing straight up. I find those to be um, fairly good cutting stock to stick with some success. And they're also going to have that kind of upright form that most of us desire for the shrub that we're looking for. All right. So there are going to be different types of cuts that we're going to be covering. So the one on the left here, our straight cut, that is the one that is most often employed for stem cuttings. But the heel cut in the middle and the mallet cut, that just refers to the amount of previous season's growth, older wood that is connected to that stem cutting. Again, it's one of those things that depends by species, depends on the research that you do to see how much of a mallet cut or heel cut is even necessary. You're likely just going to need a straight cut for it. We were talking, well, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So if you're going to take a cut right here at this angle, the top portion would be considered your terminal cutting. Again, certain species, they will continue to kind of grow straight if you take the terminal cutting, but any cutting taken below this point would be considered internodal. They won't always grow straight, or if they did, you would want to kind of select a node that is growing somewhat in the direction that you're hoping the top growth to take place. The I'll also make note is if you're ever cutting something that is oppositely branch that has opposite leaf arrangement, you want to kind of cut that straight across the top so that way you're allowing both of those nodes to kind of take off, and that will affect the form of your plant, and it'll kind of give it these little devil horns. So just be mindful of your stock cutting when you're sticking that. And I've got a few examples of some oppositely arranged plants that have been rooted out through cuttings. All right. So, like there's many different types of cuttings, there's different types of stems that you're going to be taking cuttings from. So the first one that we're going to be covering is a hardwood cutting. And these are taking in the dormant season. So you're thinking late fall, winter, usually around December here. Um, and the key with this is that you're going to want to use the most recent season's growth. So while it's not older wood, it's kind of hardened off, if that makes sense. I typically employ this method with plants that have evergreen foliage. So if you're in the Piedmont, the American holly, so kind of the one that we do this often with. Uh, Cutting size and diameter can often be keys to success, but again, like so many of these, it's going to vary by plant species and depend on some of that research. But in general, you're going to want to have a cutting that's about 3 to 5 inches long, anywhere from an eighth inch diameter to about a half inch diameter, and that's probably getting a little thick to it. But typically with these cuttings, just because it's on that one season's growth, you're not going to have something very too thick or too thin. You want to, that section of the cutting that you're getting at, you want to make sure that you are able to at least have one leaf node that you're able to remove and stick below the surface. And you're going to want to have, 1 to 2 leaf nodes above that at least, that still contain the leaves that are able to photosynthesize and provide energy to the plant. Um, Hardwood cuttings, again, I mentioned that are often done with evergreen plants, but you can certainly do this with deciduous species. These are typically done as live stakes, often for like stream bank restoration. And in this area, it's typically done with like elderberry. I know red osier dogwood is probably something more up north that would get used. And I've heard of willow getting used as well, but I've also heard from a stream bank restorationist that they tend to fall over in about 3 to 5 years just because they get so top heavy and they fall into the stream. All right. Other types of cuttings that you can take would be a semi-hardwood, a greenwood cutting. So this is basically, again, on the current season's growth. And if you're going to go out after this presentation, like I hope you would, do some cuttings, that's probably the most likely type of cutting that you're going to be getting this time of year, being middle of the summer. The other good thing about semi-hardwood cuttings is that you can continue to take cuttings, stick them, and get them to root out until the early fall. I've rooted things out until September, October. But the one thing that you have to keep in mind is how are you going to overwinter that cutting? So if it doesn't have enough hardy roots sent out and you're leaving it outside, it may not be able to survive that our heavy, our cold winters with fluctuating temperatures that are typically pretty wet as well. In terms of the length of the cutting, again, 3 to 6 inches, you're just wanting to make sure that you're able to get several nodes above and at least 2 nodes would be great if you can get that below our media surface. If you are taking a cutting during the growing season, there's often a chance that there's going to be some sort of phenological activity. It could be in flower or fruit. So if you do take that, it's best to just remove any sort of fruit or flowers because that plant is trying to exhaust all of its resources to producing good, viable seed. And by removing that, it kind of takes that opportunity away. And then we have our softwood and herbaceous cutting. So this is going to be kind of the succulent but firm new growth that is taking place in this. That will start in the spring is when you can kind of do this. I know this is how we will do a lot of our viburnum and azalea cuttings is through their softwood cuttings. But again, you're going to want to make sure it's firm. And so you'll kind of know when you remove your plant, if it starts wilting, that's referred to as flagging by just hanging down. That is probably not going to produce a viable cutting. It's probably already too stressed. So you're going to want to do something that is firm and turgid. Again, it is going to be kind of a similar length with the same concept of the amount of nodes that you want on below the media surface. I find oftentimes with herbaceous cuttings when you're doing this, the roots kind of emerge from the bottom of the stem versus a leaf node or kind of further up the stem is just one of my observations. But this is kind of where cultural controls can become important because the softwood cuttings tend to be more susceptible to decay. So you're just wanting to make sure that you're selecting a healthy plant, and then you're trying to use some sanitary cultural controls, which we'll talk about some of these later on. All right, so some considerations if you want to have success for your stem cutting. One is the age of the plant, not just the age of the overall plant, but the from where the portion of the plant that you're taking that stem cutting from. So I mentioned suckers or epicormic growth tend to be pretty pretty successful if you're trying to do stem cutting propagation. That's because it is a younger portion of that plant shooting up, but you don't want to kind of do an older, stressed out version of it. The term that they use is juvenility. You just want to make sure that it's kind of still full of life and very hormonal because that's a key to this process as well. Take into account the health and location of the plant. So many times we will take a cutting and that will be able to root it out, and then that will become a stock plant, meaning we're keeping that plant in a container and that we're going to use that plant for as a source for future cutting so that we don't have to go out to the field and hunt them down. It makes it a little bit easier for propagation. If you have stock plants, well, they're going to be you need to fertilize those regularly or sufficiently so that they're again going to have all of those photosynthates that are going to drive this hormone process. Like I've mentioned earlier, if you do have any sort of fruit or flower that is on the plant, it is good to just remove any of that so it's not exhausting any resources for that. And then time of year. So this may depend on the species that you're getting it from when you're going to most likely have success. So again, I was mentioning azaleas can go from softwood cuttings. But the time of year will also dictate the type of cutting you're going to get, whether it's going to be a softwood, semi-hardwood, or a hardwood cutting. So I mentioned right now would be a perfect time to get semi-hardwood or even still some softwood if you've got some emergent growth that isn't going to be flagging in time. All right. So before you make the cut, there's a few kind of collection and handling tips that you should be aware of. Well, the first one is that if you want to propagate a plant, well, you have to have access to that plant, know where you can obtain a stem cutting from. It seems pretty obvious, but one other obstacle that you're going to have to go uh, to overcome. And then make sure that you just have permission or you're allowed to enter that property, take from that shrub or cutting. And if it's on public lands, you will need permits to require for that. And it's just a matter of, asking, having a reason why you're doing it, and then explaining your processes so that they feel comfortable granting that permit to you. So again, I've mentioned making sure that you're selecting it from a healthy plant that is of proper age. But another key is to make sure that the term that I have below this is turgid. So you want it to be watered sufficiently so that it is full of water and not stressed out or drought stressed at all. So one technique that you can do if you do have access to the plant, and we haven't had any downpours, is to go out and hand water that plant the night before you take the cutting. And then when you do take that cutting, you want to do it the next day as early as possible when the leaves are still turgid and the plant hasn't tried to photosynthesize or do too much else. So this can be, at the crack of dawn, but Usually you want to do it before the heat of the day. Where we're at in the summer, in Atlanta, it's hot by like 8:30. So just, it's something that you want to do as early as possible to ensure that you're going to have some success. After you make the cut, or even before you make the cut, you want to make sure that you're able to store and handle your propagoules properly so that that way that they're going to kind of survive this transplant shock and still root out like we want it to. So a few helpful items for collecting the stem cutting will be some bypass pruning snips that we have here. Make sure that those are sharp and clean. Um, it's good to store your cuttings in a resealable bag. One large enough to fit about 15 lemons, or a 2-gallon bag I find to be pretty sufficient for us to hold multiple cuttings for it. Label and marker, cannot stress that enough, is that you want to be able to record what you're cutting on the bag. You're gonna think that you can remember it, but sure enough, over time, it's going to be one of those things that you just misplace, and then it becomes a lot more difficult to IDing it, knowing some, especially if provenance information is something that you're concerned about or tracking, then labeling is certainly key. After I take a stem cutting and put it into our resealable plastic bag, it's also good to give it a spritz of water to prevent this from drying out. And if you're in the field collecting this, or even around the nursery collecting it, it is good to store this in a cooler with ice packs, and this is going to kind of help preserve the tissue. But in general, after you make your cutting, try to keep it around 40 degrees, and then you can keep it in that condition for several days before you're actually sticking your cuttings. So I'm going to do a little attempt to do a live hands-on demonstration here later. And those were all cuttings that I took bright and early this morning, but have been storing in the fridge and moved them to my cooler so that way that they'll be nice and happy from when we're going to wound them and get them to do some magic for us. All right, so we're almost ready to get started. There's going to be a few things that you need, and that's going to be media to put it in a rooting structure. So the media has served several purposes for the plant, and it should have a few key properties. One of those being um, sharp drainage, but retaining some moisture, those opposing properties that all of our soilless media should have. When it comes to sticking cuttings, we find that perlite is kind of an ideal media to be using. Um, Again, it's going to allow water to drain through, but not completely dry out. And then there will be enough pockets for air to surround the stem so that way it's not kind of suffocating or promoting any sort of rot and decay. There's other medias you can use. You can kind of even um, play with your own mixes. So sand, vermiculite, pine bark, or peat moss have all been used to root out things in the past. I would certainly recommend all of these than like a cup of water. And the reason why is because sure, you can get a lot of things to root out from water, but then you have to just always be thinking of what is going to the next step going to be. So you're going to have to remove that from water, get it to be initiate into a soilless based media, and then there's just a lot of transplant shock. So I certainly recommend one of these medias. Peat moss, can be problematic. It's great for growing plants in pots, but I find for stem cuttings, it kind of retains too much moisture without enough air around the stem. So that has one that's kind of promoting decay. So the standard mix, somewhat, that we use at our community supported propagation sites is going to be 3 parts of our outdoor growing mix. And that is essentially just a combination of mostly aged pine bark with a little bit of sand in it. Great drainage with that. And then we'll add that to 2 parts of perlite. And we just use kind of a bucket to measure all of that out and then screen it so it's kind of uniform in size. And then you need a rooting structure to put all of this in. The purpose of the rooting structure is basically to just remain a high relative humidity or 100% humidity around the leaves. The reason why this is beneficial is going to prevent, or it's going to stop the plant from transpiring. This is when the plant is taking up water from its roots, bringing it up through the stem, and then that's where it plants get their turgor pressure or how they're able to stand upright. So it also draws a lot of energy out from it. So by keeping the leaves at 100% humidity, they're not going to transpire, and then that way the plant will start kind of having the other sort of stress hormone responses take over, and then that's what we're looking for to eventually send out roots. Um, so your rooting structure, if it's growing outside, and I certainly would recommend doing this outside, because well, you're about to see me do it inside, I guess. But you want it to be in deep shade if you're outside. But if you want to do this indoors, just you need some ample light around, so maybe closer to a window that doesn't get direct sun. But again, the structure is going to protect it from the elements. This can be as simple as using a humidity dome or as advanced as a mist house. So maybe I'll do a little, you can look at me on the camera. So we've been using these. This is a little cloche as a humidity dome. As you can see, a lot of water in there. So it is serving to trap in the moisture. And then another sort of at-home simple rooting structure you can use is right here. It's just a styrofoam cooler that we've placed our media inside. We did poke drainage holes on the very bottom of it, and then we'll just top it with some clear plastic and then secure that with a bungee cord. And then we find that to be kind of a cheap way that, supplies that are readily available, something that anyone on this Zoom call can get into. Another kind of more advanced would be a mist house, and this is what we have been growing out of our community-supported propagation sites with the lovely engineer of Whit Kirkland, who is a partner at our Boy Scout Road nursery. Having a mist house, again, it's basically something that is going to provide intermittent watering. So we at our sites we will send out a mist cycle for 10 seconds about every 10 minutes, and this is all controlled by a timer that we have on our left that is sending a signal to a irrigation valve that's plumbed into our mist house structure in the center, and then inside of that, it's has these upright risers, PVC risers with mist heads, and that's what is spraying all of our plants, keeping them nice and humid, preventing them from drying out. And and so, while all of this is great to have, it's just going to show you that your technique and process of collecting the stem cuttings will be much more of a bigger factor for you to have success. You don't need a mist house. This is just a great way for you to grow more plants at one time. So have fun with that. All right, we are almost getting there. So there are a few stem cutting treatments that I had referenced earlier. So I said auxin was the primary plant hormone that helps initiate rooting. There are several varieties of artificial auxin, or I guess lab created auxins. They can be a liquid powder or a liquid concentrate or a talc powder. We'll kind of go over the pros and cons on my little hand-on demonstration. And then I mentioned, this is a wounding response. Sometimes when you're doing a woody cutting, you're going to be lightly exposing the cambium layer. So it means that you're just scraping the outer portion of the bark away. It is important that you would do this with like a razor blade, something very kind of precise that isn't going to make too deep of a cut. Because again, what you're trying to do is remove that outer physical barrier, exposing that meristem tissue so that roots can emerge. And we will do a little brief demonstration on how that can work out. But again, record keeping, that will be one of the main things that for you that will continue that will drive continued success for you. So I will admit that I did this because I had to for a class. I'm not typically that, but it's something that I'm going to get better at as we go along with this. And I just want to kind of point out a few things on this slide here. So this was an example of a Calicarpa americana beauty berry, but this was the white morph. So just an example of a one of the reasons why you would want to take a cutting from a plant is to ensure that you know the color of its flower or fruit. Something else to make note of is I would mark what sort of treatment I applied to this one. And this one says I did not treat it at all. I did wound the stems. I grew this in a greenhouse, and so I would that it was still had the misting to prevent leaves from transpiring and drying out, but it it was more open air, so it wasn't quite as humid in it. So we would have to continue to water that. So I would water it 2 to 3 times a week just to prevent that perlite media from drying out inside the pot, different than the leaves. And then the other thing that I'd like to mention out here is that my second observation, within 10 days of me doing this, almost every single of my propagules dropped their leaves. That can happen. Not necessarily a bad sign. It means that the plant isn't dead yet and it's still trying to send out roots and keep living. So it's one of those things that you want to make sure that, again, you're following your process technique and you're just always remaining hopeful that something good is going to grow. And I think that is one of the keys to propagation. It's just keeping the faith. Um, Here are some additional resources that I used to put together this slide presentation, as well as the wonderful feedback from Whit Kirkland that I mentioned previously. Before we go to questions, I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to try to adjust my camera so that my live demonstration works out. Let's see how this goes. So I mentioned that there is going to be several different types of hormone treatments that you can do for your stem cutting. So the one that is most readily available, I find in stores, is kind of the powdered form. This is Hormodin 1. This goes into concentrations 1, 2, and 3. 1 being kind of for herbaceous cuttings or kind of semi-hardwoods, whereas 3 just has a higher concentration of auxin. Another one that you can use would be a liquid hormone. And this is nice because it's in a concentrate, so you can kind of dilute it to a necessary strength depending on your cutting. This is going to be alcohol based, so sometimes that can be a little rough for herbaceous stem cutting. So it's really great to penetrate woody cuttings. And then here's something that is kind of available in kind of a hardware stores, rooting gel. Um, I like it. It's got a nice little purple color that makes it seem like it would taste like grape flavored candy. Um, Definitely don't try it. But I've certainly had success with all three of these. Again, they can help promote rooting, but again, it's going to be your cultural controls, your technique and process that is going to drive success. So I will start out with some of our cuttings. I'm going to start out with an herbaceous cutting here. This plant right here, maybe some of us can already tell, is Spigelia. It's got opposite leaf arrangements, and it does have its post flower. This is one of our spring flowering plants. Um, Oftentimes with herbaceous plants, when they're in flower or about to flower, they're sending up certain hormones that it's not going to lend itself to success. So you want to do it kind of before it goes to flower, or for some of our early spring plants, you're not going to have that firm enough growth. So it's good to do it after flower. And it doesn't look like this one even really set seed as well. But as I mentioned previously, we're going to want to take off any sort of seed capsule or flower that is on here. So we're just going to go ahead, take our snips and remove this. Um, and then so here we are left with our propagule. So we've got 1, 2, 3 sets of nodes that we're going to be giving it from. I am going to go ahead and stick basically the top of this plant and expose the leaf nodes from further on from this middle node. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and make an angled cut. This is good because it's also going to expose more of that cambium layer. I'm going to also remove these leaves down here to expose our leaf node where more of that meristematic tissue is going to evolve. This is where I would certainly want to get a sharp razor blade that is going to make a nice clean cut, not too deep into our stem. So it's just a matter of down there. So we've kind of got our propagule to almost get ready to stick. Sometimes, so we've removed our apical meristem. That was going to be at the very top of it. We've exposed some of our vascular tissue at the bottom through this bottom portion of the stem and through our leaf nodes here. And if this were a woody plant species, we would want to try to do some more wounding, but we're not going to worry about that now. The other thing that people always want to are questioning about is, do you cut the leaves? I mean, if you're able to leave the leaves whole and not cut them, the plant would appreciate it. But we do cut the leaves for kind of two primary reasons. So the one main reason is that it's going to reduce the surface area of the leaf, and that is just less area that is going to transpire or potentially try to lose water from this plant. I am going to kind of spritz it since I did take it out of the bag. Again, we want to try to keep our plants happy here in the nursery. Again, we're cutting our leaves to reduce the surface area, but also if you're sticking many of them together and they're overlapping, any leaves that are touching each other are going to kind of rot off and form decay. So that's another reason why you're going to want to do that. And then for this instance, we want to do it so that we can get it inside of our domed lid. So here I've got some of our Hormodin 1 already lined up. It is good to just go ahead and measure out some of this versus sticking your cutting into the big jar of sticking media, just in case you have any sort of disease that may be on the stem. You don't want to have that transfer into your entire stock of sticking media, excuse me. So again, we're just going to coat the bottom of our stem in our liquid powder right here. And then I've got, for this demonstration, and something that you guys could also use to root out things at home, is these little kind of like 3.5-inch round pots that come with a domed lid right here. You can get these in bundles online for very cheap. And so this is a kind of a mixture that we had left over from last year. And so it's not our standard mixture, but it is mostly equal parts vermiculite and perlite. Vermiculite, it's a good media. It kind of retains sometimes too much moisture and it rots off, or it breaks down over time. And when it breaks down, it becomes kind of clay-like. So again, that's why I've been a fan of just perlite and pine bark as medias, but this was just available. So use what's available. I'm inserting my stem into our media like such. I'm not sticking it all the way in. You want to kind of have it hovering about halfway through our container. And then the other part of this technique that is very important is to go ahead and firm the media around it. This is going to make sure that, well, again, the media had that purpose of keeping the plant upright. That will ensure that it doesn't start to lean over, but it's maintaining contact with that perlite. So it's having that moisture, but also that gas exchange. That is certainly a very important part of the technique. And I feel as if it also kind of transfers your living energy over to the plant and it's just helping him along. We're going to cap it. I'm going to give it one more spritz, keep him happy. And then I'm going to go ahead and cap it with our humidity dome. All right, that is an example of an herbaceous plant cutting. I mentioned previously that sometimes you will do a heel cut, which is contains the previous season's growth. So right here, we actually have a sourwood tree that was sending up a lot of suckers. I have not rooted a sourwood tree before, so I'm going to give it a shot. They're one of my favorite trees in terms of flower, growth habit, fall color. It checks off all of those boxes. So it's one that we certainly can't get enough into propagation. But right here would be kind of considered the heel for this. So this would have been the previous year's stem. And then all of this was growth from this year. So we're going to go ahead and prepare our cutting. So for the heel cut, what I'm going to do is just kind of maintain some of this tissue below. And the reason why I'm doing a heel cut for this is because right before we started, I read the Durr book, and he said that there was a decent success rate for sourwood cuttings taken with the heel in July with softwood growth. So this is still quite hasn't hardened off. Um, you'll kind of start seeing some of the bark plates forming if it was hardening off. Um, if I were to try to stick this in one of our humidity domes right here, it's going to be too tall for it. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and reduce the height of it. And I'm going to reduce it to this node right here because I think this would be kind of a good place for the plant to kind of continue on its kind of have this node take over apical dominance and be the one growing hopefully straight up. We'll see. Here. Okay, so this is going to be what I'm going to use for my cuttings. It's about 5 inches long. And these leaves right here, I'm going to remove, and I'm going to have these be the leaves for the top. So to remove the leaves on the bottom, again, I'm just going to take my razor blade and then just ever so slightly continue to wound around our leaf node that I removed, exposing more of that cambium layer. So as you can see, it's important to do this with the razor blade so that you can kind of get a nice clean cut just below the surface. Whereas, I've certainly done this with our bypass snips. You just want to make sure that they're very sharp and clean, but again, you're more likely to go too deep with these guys and make a bad cut. And I'm going to go ahead and snip off our lead right here to kind of reduce our surface area, less transpiration. Another thing, so if our leaves for this were to fall out, again, nothing to freak out about. The main thing to be aware of is that, anything green on a plant contains chlorophyll. Those cells are able to photosynthesize and keep feeding, supplying the plant with energy. So again, I'm going to apply this media to all of our exposed cambium layer. And let's see if we can get this into our cup. So again, we're going about, this one's about 2/3 of the way in there, but then I'm going to press it in and cover this with our cup. This guy. I mentioned earlier, some plants will grow differently based on, well, the species and where the cut is. So this is one of those white beauty berries that we had taken cuttings from. And this is an example of opposite branching and how it continues to kind of grow often due to these two opposite node kind of devil horn locations. Just something to be mindful of as when you're selecting the height of the plant that you're looking for, as well as the general form that you want it to take on. And I go all that to say is, so here was another cutting that we took off. Right here was the current season's growth that we used, and this was its first thing that it sprout out, and then it started growing off this way. So if you look at the plant, it's kind of growing at a little odd angle. This would be one that we could benefit from staking it up a little bit more straight. But it's just kind of one of those concepts of when you're making your cut, try to be mindful of where that node is already oriented because it's going to continue to grow in that direction. And lastly, everyone's always wondering, all right, I did all that. It worked. It was great. I've got roots going on. What is next? So basically, this is all fairly sterile media, and you want to step it up into something that has some fertilizer for the plants over time. So this is one of our American hollies. This is actually if you've ever been to Woodlands Garden, this is the Maryland dwarf that they have growing throughout their landscape. So again, another plant that has a specific growth habit, and that's why we're propagating it vegetatively to preserve that trait or feature. But as you can kind of see here, roots have emerged. Roots have emerged to the sidewall of this 2-inch container that we grew it out in. That is an excellent indicator that it needs a bigger pot and it would also appreciate some nutrients and some more water. Another consideration again, sometimes if you're doing this into the fall, sometimes it can be beneficial to leave it into that rooting container and waiting for the new next year's new growth to emerge before you want to step that up. I'm going to try to make it not as much of an awkward transition. And I'll turn it over to any questions you guys may have.
So I'm familiar with like just cutting off something and putting it in a glass of water and just seeing if roots come out of it. What 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 plants usually do well in that environment?
House plants, I would say. You know, yeah, some vines, I'm sure like, some of our easier to root things, like I've mentioned, elderberry and beautyberry, they may send out roots. But again, you don't want to continue to grow that plant out in the water. You're eventually going to have to transport it into some media, whether it be in a pot or into the ground. And having it overcome that transplant shock is very difficult when you're going from just a liquid environment to, a bit more harsher elements. I will say that I'll do one more show and tell here. So, I've stressed on doing research, but never be afraid to try something to see if it will root out. So this is a fairy wand that needs to get put into a pot. But fairy wand Camium lyrium luteum. I didn't have any sort of information on if that would root out or whatnot. It seems like it would because it's a rhizomatous plant, but it's one that I came across. We accidentally damaged it. I stuck it in some hormone, put it into my rooting chamber, and kind of just forgot about it, walked away, and then in about 3 to 4 weeks, it started having roots emerge, and now it's to the point where I need to put it into a pot and kind of keep it happy and watered.
Good. And then the last thing I did, I wanted to get your opinion on some common bushes that I'd be interested to see if they do well in this type of environment of cutting. So blueberries, native azaleas, and then native like smooth hydrangea.
Yes, all of those. So with blueberries and azaleas, those tend to kind of be timing specific. Azaleas, you're going to want to do those in the spring, taking that softwood cutting. With blueberries, they are a spring flowering one, so you're typically going to want to wait for that window right when they've just passed setting fruit is when we stick our Boy Scout Road blueberries. I've also read some research that is another one that you can do through hardwood cuttings. It's, oak leaf, it can be one of the more difficult hydrangeas to root out, but smooth hydrangea is one that you can certainly have a lot of success with. That's why, that the double flower form, the Annabelle, is so popular too. But again, that's, not quite as beneficial to pollinators.
But I see Misty asked the question of how were you measuring the root lengths on the Calocarpa cuttings, the beautyberry? Were you pulling them out of the medium to check?
Ah, yeah. So, I was. And that's kind of a controversial technique because you are kind of disrupting the whatever process is going on with the plant. I was doing that kind of as a learning experiment to see what is going on physically with this stem over time. So it was one that I was routinely taking them all out. I think that if you're able to just kind of, if you're not worried about kind of these constant updates of when is it starting to form callus tissue, when is it's forming roots, it's just kind of, it may be more beneficial to just leave them in the cup. And there's kind of a little tug test. You want to, if you get any sort of resistance, it's likely that roots are starting to emerge. And then you can also, what I did previously, just kind of take the media because it'll be molded into that cup form and see if you have any roots emerging from
So
there.
I see where Susan had asked. So a large number of the hollow stem Joe Pye weed that we dug up seemed to regrow from the roots that weren't completely removed from it. Is that common to reproduce plants through root cuttings?
Yes, root cuttings. Well, okay, so it's it can be an adventitious root or a rhizome. With those hollow stem Joe Pies that we've got that big plates from you still in production. Thank you for those, Susan. I think those would be adventitious roots. What I have had success for getting those to root out. Well, so yes, they will continue to send up shoots. They'll have these latent nodes on them that can kind of form that root and shoot interface on them. But when I get like a section of a root and or rhizome to get that to root out, or to, I guess, both leaf out and root out, is I've had success wrapping it in a damp paper towel, storing that in a plastic bag to keep its humidity, and then keeping it in the shade, waiting like a week, and then you'll kind of see some leaves shooting out, and then you can kind of pop that up and then wait for the roots to emerge, if that answers your question.
Yep, good. So Caitlin asked, what's the potting mix that you use at CSP once the cuttings are ready to be potted? And then what are some guidelines for knowing if a rooted cutting will be able to overwinter in the ground?
Yeah, I don't have much experience rooting out something and transplanting it straight into the ground. So I wouldn't necessarily know unless it was something again like one of those deciduous hardwood live stakes that you're planting. The potting mix that we use, so it's at Boy Scout Road. We're, eventually going to be more kind of streamlined, uniform with all of our processes. But Boy Scout Road, they use that outdoor growing mix that I mentioned. So that is just aged pine bark that is ground to different kind of particle sizes with added sand to it. And because we do add about, I think, 30% of a pro mix to ours up at Stone Mountain. So we'll use that outdoor growing mix and add a little bit more peat moss to our mix just so it retains a little bit moisture to it. We don't have to irrigate it as much is, kind of the trade-off that we're working with that. And then it is very important to add slow release fertilizer. If you're going to leave your rooted cutting in its cup overwintered in some sort of protective shelf, like a cold frame would certainly do much better than outside. Um, you know, you're gonna want to maybe not when it's dormant, but as it's emerging from dormancy, liquid feed it on like a quarter strength liquid fertilizer would be beneficial. And if it roots out, say you started this process right now, and by August it's rooting out. It wouldn't hurt the plant. It would be beneficial to give it just a light dose of liquid fertilizer. Again, quarter strength.